There are moments in life when the past reaches out and grabs you by the wrist. Not gently. Not with a soft tap on the shoulder. But with a cold, firm grip that stops you right where you stand. You could be doing something completely ordinary, going through old boxes, flipping through a family photo album, or searching a government database for the sake of paperwork, and then, without any warning at all, the ground beneath you shifts. What you thought you knew about the people closest to you begins to look completely different. And once you see it, once that truth is standing right in front of you, fully formed and undeniable, you cannot unsee it. You cannot go back to the comfortable version of the world you were living in just moments before. That is the kind of story we are going to sit with today. Not one story, but several. Each one belonging to a real person who was simply living their life, grieving a parent, spending the holidays with family, texting a sibling over old memories, trying to open a small business, when something hidden came crawling out of the dark. These are the kinds of secrets that families bury. The kind they agree, sometimes without ever saying a word out loud, to simply never speak of again. And in each of these stories, the person telling it had no idea what was waiting for them inside a dusty laptop bag, a forgotten photo album, a hidden photograph tucked between the pages of a book, or a name on a government registry that looked just a little too familiar. Some of these secrets involve betrayal. Some involve crime. Some involve grief so heavy and so complicated that the people carrying it have never fully found their way back to the surface. And one of them, one of the most painful ones, is about a young man who was loved deeply, who had a whole future ahead of him, and who chose a path so dark and so devastating that the people who raised him had to mourn him twice. Once when he disappeared. And once when they understood why. So if you are here with us today, settle in. Make yourself comfortable. Because these are not light stories. They are real, they are raw, and they are the kind that stay with you long after the telling is done. And if this is your first time joining us here, we are so glad you found us. Please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you never miss a story. We share new narrations regularly, and this community of listeners is one of the warmest, most thoughtful groups of people you will ever come across. Now, let us begin. Before we get into the personal stories shared by our community, there is one more that deserves a mention, a historical one. On the 1st of November, 1955, United Airlines Flight 629 exploded shortly after lifting off from the runway in Denver, Colorado. All 44 people on board lost their lives in an instant. When investigators began sifting through the wreckage scattered across that Colorado field, what they uncovered was not the mechanical failure they might have expected. The truth was far darker. The explosion had come from within the aircraft itself. And at the center of the investigation was a quiet, seemingly ordinary suitcase, a grieving son, and a plan so cold and calculated that it had been disguised as misfortune. It is the kind of story that reminds you how thin the line can be between what people show the world and what they are truly capable of. We will leave that story there for now, but keep it in the back of your mind as you listen to what comes next. Because the theme of hidden darkness runs like a thread through everything you are about to hear. Story 1, What was inside my father's laptop bag? About 10 years ago, my father passed away. He died of natural causes, but the death was sudden enough that it hit our family with a force none of us were really prepared for. He had been there one day, and then he simply was not. And as anyone who has lost a parent knows, no matter how complicated the relationship, that absence leaves a shape in your life that nothing else quite fills. After the funeral was over, after the inheritance paperwork had been filed and the difficult practical matters had been sorted through, I was asked whether I would like to take a few boxes of his belongings. My parents had divorced when my little sister and I were still children. My father had lived on the other side of the country, and our time with him had always been limited. He was a workaholic at his core, a man who poured most of himself into his career and had very little left over for the people who needed him. Weekend visits were only possible when his schedule allowed. And so when it came time to divide up the 3 cardboard boxes that held what remained of his personal life, the rest of the family was happy for me to take all of them. A few days after they were delivered, I found myself standing in my living room, staring at those 3 boxes without opening them. I am not sure I can explain it in a way that makes perfect logical sense, but opening them felt like the final confirmation. Like the last door closing. I had already attended the funeral. I had already sat through all the formalities. But those boxes were his. And opening them meant accepting, on some deep and personal level, that he was never coming back. I gave myself a few days. And then I gave myself a few more. And then one quiet afternoon, I finally found the courage to cut the tape and peel back the flaps of the first box. It was as emotional as I knew it was going to be. Inside those boxes was a whole world I had only ever glimpsed in pieces. Baseball cards from decades past. Old photographs of my father and my aunt as children, grinning at the camera in the way that children do when they have no idea yet what life is going to ask of them. There was a vintage Fender Stratocaster, still resting in its case, the kind of instrument that would be worth several $1,000s today. There was a beautifully made shirt from an expensive tailor in New York, still pressed and folded with care. And then, at the bottom of one of the boxes, I found a laptop bag. It was old, clearly from the mid-1990s at the very least, but it was extraordinarily well made. Large sections of it were crafted from what appeared to be genuine leather, soft and worn in the way that real leather gets over time. The design was thoughtful, with multiple pockets and compartments, and it had held up remarkably well for its age. I decided I would have it cleaned up and refurbished, and then use it myself. It looked sharp. It had character. But before I could do any of that, I needed to make sure every pocket and pouch was empty. In one compartment, I found a handful of old receipts. In another, I found some Italian lira, the currency Italy used before the euro came along. And then, in a third small pocket, tucked away as if it had been placed there deliberately, I found an envelope. The name written on the front of it was not my father's. In fact, it was not really a name at all. It simply said, "Honey." At first, I assumed it was an old letter from my mother, something written back when they were still happy together, still in that early warm phase of their marriage before things fell apart. I thought it might be a sweet thing to read. A reminder that they had once loved each other, once chosen each other freely and with hope. I opened the envelope with that thought in mind. And then I saw the photographs. I will not go into detail. But they were not the kind of photographs you find tucked into a love letter from your mother. I dropped the envelope immediately, as if it had burned my fingers. Now I was not only unsettled by the photographs, I was reluctant to even read the letter, knowing what it had been sharing space with. But I told myself that if the contents got uncomfortable, I would simply stop reading and then get rid of the whole thing entirely. So I unfolded the letter. And within the very first few lines, something felt off. The handwriting was not my mother's. I noticed it right away, though I tried to talk myself out of the suspicion at first. I had once studied neurological topics in college, and I knew that handwriting genuinely changes over time. Stress, age, illness, mood, all of these things affect the way a person forms their letters. So I did not immediately leap to conclusions. But then I kept reading. The letter referenced places my father and the writer had visited together. California. My mother and father, to my knowledge, had never traveled to California together. And even if they had, it seemed like the kind of thing that would have come up at some point in conversation over the years, even casually, even in passing. But it never had. I read a little further. And then I came across the pet names. Endearments and nicknames that were simply not the ones my mother ever used. And that was the moment I knew. This was not a letter from my mother. With my heart hammering a little harder than I would have liked, I picked up the envelope and looked at the photographs again. The woman in those photographs was not my mother. My father, before the divorce, had been having an affair. And if I had to guess, and it felt less like a guess and more like a certainty, that affair was the real reason the marriage ended. Not the irreconcilable differences listed on the paperwork. Not the vague language that divorce attorneys use to smooth things over. A woman. A secret. A whole other life running quietly alongside the one we thought we knew. What I could not figure out was why my mother had never said anything. After the divorce, she had made no secret of her feelings about my father. She was not his defender. She was not the type to protect his reputation out of some sense of loyalty to a man who had hurt her. And yet, if she had known about this affair, she had kept it entirely to herself. The only explanations I could come up with were that she had stayed quiet to protect my sister and me from a truth we did not need to carry. Or, perhaps more likely, she had simply never known. If that was the case, I made a quiet decision. I was not going to be the one to tell her. I know that some people would say I should have. And I understand that perspective. But there are some truths that do not heal anything, that only open wounds that time has finally started to close. Ignorance is bliss. That is not just a saying. That is something I believed from that moment forward. Instead, I turned to the internet. The letter had been signed off with a shortened version of a fairly common woman's name. I typed that name into a search engine along with the name of the company my father had worked at, and then I tried adding different departments, accounting, human resources, administration, to try and narrow the results. I got a few results. But they were not what I expected. They were not company directories or LinkedIn profiles. They were news articles. Older ones. From the early 1990s. Describing how a woman who had worked at the same company as my father had gone missing. I did not know her last name, so I could not be absolutely certain this was the same woman. But then I found one of the articles that included her photograph. And I did not need to be certain anymore. The woman who had gone missing in the early 90s was the same woman in those photographs from the envelope. If you have ever had a moment where the world rearranges itself around you in real time, you will know what I felt sitting at my desk with that laptop open in front of me. Everything I thought I understood shifted. And I needed more information. If you have ever found something unexpected in a loved one's belongings, something that changed the way you understood them, I imagine this story is hitting close to home right now. Write in the comments and share your thoughts. You are not alone in this, and this community is here to listen. I called my mother. I told her I needed to ask her something, and that I needed her not to ask me any follow-up questions. Not yet. Just until I was sure of what I was dealing with. She agreed, though not without some hesitation. And so I asked her what she remembered about my father's behavior around the time this woman had disappeared. I did not mention the affair. I did not mention the letter or the photographs. I simply gave her the time frame and asked if anything had been unusual at home back then. She told me she barely remembered what had happened last week, let alone something from over 2 decades ago. But she said she would think about it. And a couple of days later, she called me back. She had been thinking about it, she said, more than she expected to. And something had come back to her. My father had been under a lot of stress around that time. Something at work had been wearing him down, making him lose sleep, affecting his appetite. And then one day, out of nowhere, he announced that he was going to go on an impromptu hiking trip. The company had organized some sort of team-building getaway, a chance to decompress, and he had very little choice but to attend. He had seemed as eager as he could manage, given the state he was in. He was gone for 3 or 4 days. When he came home, my mother said, she had expected to see some improvement. A man who had taken a break and returned with a bit more life in him. But it was the opposite. He was worse. He slept for nearly a full day after coming back. He was moody, distant, difficult to reach. It took him weeks, she said, before he started to return to anything resembling his normal self. And looking back, she told me, she realized now that that stretch of time was the beginning of the end. The marriage never quite recovered after that. She filed for divorce roughly a year later. She had done it slowly, trying to work things out, but eventually she had accepted that the man who had come back from that hiking trip was not the same man who had left. She told me all of this, and then, in a voice that had grown small and cautious, she asked me what I had found. I told her I had a few more things to check before I could give her the full picture. But I warned her that whatever I was about to tell her would be upsetting at best, and at worst, it might be genuinely frightening. She said okay. And her voice when she said it, I have never quite forgotten that sound. The following morning, I called the police. I told them I had information that might be relevant to a missing person case from the early 1990s, and I handed over everything I had, the love letter, the photographs, and what my mother had told me about my father's strange behavior during the period when the woman had vanished. The officer who took my statement listened carefully. The case was old, the evidence was circumstantial, and my father was dead. None of it ever led to a formal announcement. No suspect was named. One follow-up call came, asking me to clarify a few details. And then nothing. Silence. That part, making the report, was one of the most surreal, heartbreaking things I have ever done in my life. Calling the police to tell them that my own father might have had something to do with a woman's disappearance. Even now, I am not sure there is language adequate enough to describe what that feels like. But if that poor woman had family somewhere who had spent decades hoping for answers, then I had to do it. I could not live with myself otherwise. Telling my mother was harder. That part was far, far harder. It was not just the affair, as devastating as that was on its own. It was the possibility, however unconfirmed, that the man she had shared her life with, the man she had raised children with, might have been involved in something terrible. I watched her sink into a depression after our conversation that lasted for weeks. And I understood it completely. Because even in the best possible version of this story, she had been sharing her home with a man who was secretly grieving the loss of a woman he had loved in secret. And in the worst possible version, she had been sleeping beside someone capable of something unthinkable. I live with this knowledge every day. It does not get lighter. And the thing that frightens me most is not what I already know. It is the possibility that one day, years from now, I might get a phone call telling me that the case has finally been solved. And that I will have to face what that answer looks like. Story 2, the photo album and the twin nobody talked about. Not long after the holidays one year, I found myself spending Christmas with relatives, my aunt and uncle and a handful of cousins, the kind of gathering that stretches from mid-afternoon all the way to late evening, well past the point where the desserts have been finished and the second bottle of something has been opened. My aunt and uncle were the kind of people who decorated their home with photographs. Their kitchen walls were covered with them, family pictures spanning decades, a visual record of birthdays and holidays and ordinary days that had been deemed worth remembering. Late in the evening, as the party wound down and a few of us settled around the table with a glass or two, we started looking at the photos more closely. Reminiscing. Teasing each other gently about hairstyles and clothing choices from years gone by. My uncle had a head of hair in the 1970s that was, in the most affectionate possible way, absolutely hilarious. He took the ribbing in good humor, laughed along with all of us, and then stood up with a gleam in his eye and announced that if we thought his hair was something, we had not seen anything yet. He disappeared upstairs to retrieve some old photo albums, despite my aunt calling after him in a tone that suggested he was dancing very close to the edge of her patience. Aunt Janie's hair from the 1980s, it turned out, was absolutely magnificent. She had clearly been channeling her inner Grace Jones, and honestly, she had pulled it off. My uncle brought down a whole box of albums, and we began passing them around the table, flipping through the pages one by one. I picked up a particular album that seemed older than the others. The photos inside had that sepia warmth of images taken a long time ago, and the paper had the slightly yellowed quality of something that had been stored away for many years. I turned the pages slowly, taking in the faces and places, and then I stopped on a photograph that made me look twice. A man was standing inside what appeared to be a church, dressed in some kind of ceremonial Catholic clothing. I will be honest and say I do not know the proper name for what he was wearing. The man looked remarkably similar to my Uncle Steve. So similar, in fact, that with a bit of wine in my system and a great deal of confidence I probably should not have had, I looked up from the album and said something along the lines of, "Holy crap, Uncle Steve, when were you a priest?" My uncle, who had also been enjoying the evening, looked at me blankly for a second. Then something shifted across his face. Just briefly. He said he had never been a priest. And then he reached over, took the album from my hands rather more quickly than the moment seemed to call for. Said we had seen quite enough of that one, and closed it shut. He was not unkind about it. He was not aggressive. But something had clearly just happened that he had not planned for. My Aunt Janie noticed immediately. She rose from her chair, took the album from my uncle, and carried it back upstairs without a word. When she returned, I asked her what was going on and why the photograph had caused such a sudden change in the atmosphere. She said she did not want to put a cloud over the evening, but she would explain everything in the morning. She was true to her word. The next morning, over coffee and the kind of slow, headachy breakfast that follows a late Christmas evening, I waited for the right moment to ask. My aunt sat across from me, wrapped her hands around her mug, sighed deeply, and said she had been rather hoping I had forgotten about it. Then she told me about Simon. The man in the photograph was not my Uncle Steve. It was his non-identical twin brother. They had grown up together, looked quite similar, but had taken very different paths once they were adults. Simon had gone into the seminary after college. He had studied, trained, and eventually been ordained and sent to work for the Catholic Church in Nebraska. He had been based on the East Coast for a while, but a significant opportunity arose, a high-profile position in Lincoln, and Simon had packed his things and moved. He stayed in Lincoln for about a decade. And then one day, he sent my Uncle Steve a new address and a new phone number. Steve assumed his brother had been promoted. He called to congratulate him. But Simon had not been promoted. He had left the church entirely. And he was not a senior man with years of service behind him. He was in his mid-30s. My Uncle Steve said that something in Simon's voice during that call did not sit right with him. It had a flatness to it, a hollowness. So Steve drove all the way out to Nebraska to check on him in person. What he found when he arrived was a man who had been drinking heavily and who seemed to have quietly given up on the world. Simon said he had lost his faith, that he no longer saw any point in continuing. My uncle stayed with him until he had gotten his drinking under control, and then drove home and checked in by phone. The calls started off daily, then became every couple of days, then once a week. Gradually, Simon seemed to stabilize. He talked about wanting to write a book, something to occupy his time. He had savings from his years working for the church, and he seemed to be managing well enough on his own. My uncle cautiously assumed the worst was behind them. And then one day, Simon stopped answering his phone. My uncle drove out to Nebraska again. And when he arrived at his brother's home, he found Simon had passed away in his sleep. The cause, they would later learn, was liver disease, the result of drinking that had quietly started again, building in secret until it was too late. My uncle, trying to do the right thing by not disturbing what might have been a crime scene, did not look around the house. He reported the death, waited for the authorities, and spent the following days in a kind of suspended grief while the investigation ran its course. Once they were cleared to collect Simon's belongings, my Uncle Steve discovered two things. The first was what had killed his brother. The second was why Simon had started drinking again. And it all had to do with the book he had been writing. This was the early 90s, so Simon had been working on one of those early electronic word processors. My uncle took it home, printed out everything stored on its memory, and began to read. What he found was not a memoir. It was not the kind of book a man writes to process his faith and his doubts and his spiritual journey. It read, my uncle said, like a confession. The prestigious job Simon had been given in Lincoln had not been a reward for exceptional spiritual work. It had been a carefully defined public relations role. His responsibility, in plain language, was to manage the fallout when children were abused by priests or other members of the Catholic Church. He would visit the families. He would sit across from parents whose children had been harmed, sometimes severely, and he would use every tool available to him to convince those families to take a settlement and walk away. He would promise that the priest in question would be transferred. He would offer money, amounts that my aunt described as shamefully small given the lifelong damage being done to these children. And if the family was not persuaded by the softer approach, he would move on to harder tactics. Countersuits. Legal threats. The suggestion that pursuing this publicly would be far more difficult and costly for them than simply accepting what was being offered and moving on with their lives. And the cases were not rare. Simon had one family a week, sometimes two. He was not confined to Nebraska, he traveled across surrounding states, doing the same work wherever it was needed. For a decade, he was the quiet, professional face of an institution that was working very hard to make sure its worst crimes never saw a courtroom. The ways in which this was rationalized internally were, my aunt said, absolutely nightmarish. There were those within the church who insisted that the children themselves had been somehow responsible. That the encounters had been in some sense consensual. The perverse and disgusting logic of that position is something I cannot fully bring myself to put into words. There were others who told themselves that many of the cases were fraudulent, parents looking to extract money from a wealthy institution, inspired by a handful of legitimate incidents. And then there were those who knew the cases were real and simply did not care, because in their view the institutional good of the church outweighed the suffering of its victims. Simon had worked inside that world for 10 years. And then, eventually, it caught up with him. The weight of what he had been part of, a decade of ensuring that children could not get justice, that the people who harmed them faced no consequences, finally became too much to carry. He left the church, tried to drink the memories away, managed to get sober briefly, started writing as a way to confess what he had done, and then the drinking came back and it killed him before anyone could help him. My Uncle Steve dealt with it the only way he knew how. He locked it away. He did not go to therapy. He did not talk about it. He simply decided that Simon was no longer a brother he had lost. Simon was just someone he had grown up with who no longer deserved a place in his thoughts. There was one photograph left in an album, still there after all these years. My aunt said that my uncle knew it was there. He would not have brought that box downstairs by accident. Somewhere in him, there was a part that needed someone to see it. A quiet cry for help from a man who had spent years pretending he did not need any. I hope, with all my heart, that he eventually found someone to talk to about it. Because that is not the kind of weight a person should carry alone. Not for a week. And certainly not for years. Like this video if this story moved you in any way, and share it with someone you trust. These are the kinds of stories that remind us how deeply people carry things they never show the world. Story 3, we don't talk about him anymore. I grew up in the United Kingdom, in a Muslim family that I would describe as genuinely moderate, and I mean that in the truest sense of the word, not as a soft apology or a political statement. My sisters do not wear hijabs. We own Christmas jumpers. We have Christmas dinner. I attend mosque about once a year, around Eid. We pray together as a family when we can. We abstain from alcohol and pork. My mother is deeply in love with Italian cuisine, and would cheerfully tell you she was meant to be Italian in another life, though she always uses halal meat when she cooks. That is the household I grew up in. Warm, ordinary, grounded, and devout in a quiet and personal way. My extended family is much the same. And it is within that extended family that this story lives. A story I stumbled into entirely by accident, and one that I sometimes wish, with everything in me, that I had never uncovered. In September of last year, 2024, my sister and I were texting back and forth over Snapchat, the way siblings do when they have an hour to spare and start falling down the rabbit hole of shared memories. We got talking about a party we had attended when I was around 6 years old and she was 8. We laughed about how we had fallen out because I refused to wear a different colored dress from hers. And then, somewhere in the middle of all that laughter, something surfaced in my memory. A face. An older boy's face, lodged somewhere in the back of my mind, attached to the memory of that party. I did a quick mental inventory of our cousins, counting through them one by one. And he did not belong in any of the slots. He was extra. A spare. I could not place him as a relative, but I also could not dismiss the memory as imagination. My sister and I group texted our mother to settle it. And here is where things got strange. All of our brothers and sisters confirmed what we remembered: this boy was real, they had seen him too. But when we asked our mother directly, something unexpected happened. She denied it. She did not say she could not quite remember. She denied all knowledge. We kept giving her more details, expecting that something we said would jog her memory and she would say, "Oh yes, of course. He was so-and-so's son." But she just kept saying she did not remember. Until eventually the whole conversation started to feel wrong in a way that was hard to name but impossible to ignore. The next time I was home, I went through every family photo album I could find. Birthdays, Eid celebrations, holidays, gatherings large and small. I could not find his face anywhere. Not a single photograph. The point came where I started to feel a little as though I was losing my mind. But I knew I was not imagining things. I asked my father. My father's response was not to answer my question. Instead, he asked, in a careful and slightly frightened way, "Have you asked your mother?" He might as well have confirmed everything with those 5 words. And then he offered a vague and evasive denial that satisfied no one, least of all me. I had apparently stumbled across a family secret. I was not particularly interested in making it my mission to unravel it. I had come home for winter break, not to play detective, and I had no desire to spend those precious days upsetting my parents. I let it settle for a while, spoke to my sister about it, agreed with her that something was clearly being kept from us, and did my best to move on. But then, while I was browsing my mother's bookcase one afternoon, looking through her books to see if there were any I wanted to take back to university with me, I pulled a large hardcover from the shelf. And a photograph fell out from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. It was a family photograph. One I had never seen before. And there he was, the boy from my memory, a little younger than I remembered him, but unmistakably him. I actually gasped. I found my mother in the kitchen. I showed her the photograph and asked her, as calmly and as kindly as I could, to please tell me who this boy was. I did not make demands. I did not raise my voice. I just watched her face, and I saw the moment she understood that there was no longer any point in pretending. She took the photograph from me, told me we needed to talk in private, and led me upstairs to my bedroom. She told me that the boy was a cousin of mine. I will call him Zach. Zach had moved away to university when I was just starting primary school. And while he was there, something had happened. Something tragic. I asked if Zach had died. My mother looked at me and said, "We do not know if he is still with us. He went missing." I was confused and upset and full of questions. I suggested that perhaps I should visit our auntie, Zach's mother, to offer my condolences and let her know I was thinking of her. My mother shook her head. And then she said something that I was not prepared for, something that landed strangely and did not make sense to me at all. "We don't talk about him anymore." I was stunned. I understood that parents shield their children from painful things. I understood that grief takes many different shapes and that not everyone processes loss the same way. But I could not understand how a family simply decided to stop talking about a person who had gone missing. I pushed for more. What I got was this: Zach had gone missing during his university studies and had not been heard from since. His mother, my auntie, had made the decision not to discuss him. Out of respect for that, the family had put away all the photographs and stopped mentioning his name. The hidden photograph in the book was my mother's quiet rebellion against that rule. She could not bear to destroy every image of him, so she had tucked one away where it would not be seen. My mother told me, when she dropped me at the train station after winter break, not to approach my auntie about it. She understood my curiosity but said my auntie genuinely could not bear to speak about it. She asked me to promise. And I promised her. I want to be honest with you. I did not keep that promise. Instead of catching my train, I went and bought flowers. I wrote a note, and signed, in block capital letters so my handwriting would not be recognized, saying only that I was thinking of them and that I was sorry for their pain. Then I caught a bus to my auntie's housing estate, wearing my scarf high over my face and a woolly hat they would not recognize, and left the flowers on their doorstep. I was rather pleased with myself when I went to bed that night. The next morning, very early, my phone rang. It was my auntie. The moment I saw her name on the screen, I knew she had found me out somehow. I answered, trying to sound natural, apologizing for not having come to visit while I was home. And then she asked me, very directly and very seriously, whether I had left anything on her doorstep the previous evening. I could not lie to her. I told her yes. She did not shout. She did not call my mother to do the shouting on her behalf. She simply asked if I was free to meet with her that week. Waiting for her to arrive for that meeting was one of the most nerve-wracking things I have experienced. I expected disappointment, the kind that is worse than anger because it carries so much more weight. But when my auntie walked through the door, she was not angry. She was not disappointed. She was simply a woman who had been carrying something enormous for a very long time and had finally decided that I was ready to understand it. She asked me what I already knew. I told her. And then she filled in everything I did not. When Zach first went missing, he had simply stopped responding to calls and messages. He was supposed to arrive home on a Friday evening in December. By midnight, my auntie had heard nothing from him. She called the police. She was frightened, she told me, that he had been in a car accident on an icy road somewhere. That he was hurt, or worse. Less than 24 hours later, the police called her back. They had found Zach's car in an airport car park. He had driven to the airport and left it there. He had then boarded a flight on the same day she reported him missing. The flight had gone to Turkey. My auntie did not know what to make of it. Zach was not the type of young man who vanished on a spontaneous holiday without telling anyone. He had no reason to hide a trip, his parents were open-minded about his personal life, and if he had been traveling with a girlfriend, there would have been no need for secrecy. The Turkish destination made no obvious sense. Police told her they were in contact with Turkish authorities and would be in touch. In the meantime, my auntie mentioned the situation to a friend. When she said the word Turkey, her friend's face went pale. My auntie was not someone who followed the news closely. She had heard fragments about conflict in the Middle East, but then, she told me honestly, when had there not been conflict in the Middle East? Some of her earliest memories, like mine, involved watching news coverage of soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. It had all blurred together over the years into a general, distant anxiety that she had learned to push to the background. What she had not registered, or not fully understood, was the specific and urgent news that had emerged about a significant number of young British citizens, most of them between the ages of 15 and 30, who were using Turkey as a crossing point to enter Syria. Not for holidays. Not for travel. They were going to join a group that was known in this country as ISIS. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. My auntie's family were not, in any shape or form, the kind of family this was supposed to happen to. Zach went to the pub after football. He dated. He listened to hip-hop. He was about as far from a religious extremist as anyone could imagine. My uncle, trying to find a rational explanation, suggested the whole thing might be a trip to Istanbul to watch his football team play an away match. My auntie, at this point, was not even worried about the terrorism angle. She was just worried that her son was somewhere without telling her why. And then a special constable came to her door. My auntie is an oncology nurse. She knows what it means when someone delivers news in person rather than over the phone. She braced herself. The police officer told her what Turkish authorities had been able to determine. Zach had not stayed in Istanbul. He had transferred to another flight headed for a city closer to the Syrian border. Authorities had tracked him to a hotel in that city. When they searched his room, it was empty. The hotel staff, when questioned, recalled seeing a young man matching Zach's description meet an older man in the lobby. One of them spoke Arabic with a distinctly Syrian accent. The other spoke it hesitantly, like someone still in the early stages of learning. The police believed, with around 90% certainty, that the older man had been Zach's guide into Syria. And one of the primary reasons a young British man would travel into Syria by that route, at that time, was to join a terrorist organization. The constable was careful and gentle in the way she delivered all of this. She was a mother herself. She said the right things. She acknowledged the uncertainty, emphasized that nothing was confirmed. She asked my auntie to share any communications she received from Zach, emails, texts, calls. The fact that they asked for that, my auntie told her more than anything else they said. That is not what you do in a standard missing person case. My auntie spent several days refusing to believe it. She called it blissful denial, and I understood exactly what she meant. And then an email arrived in her work inbox. It was from Zach. He apologized. He said he knew she would have stopped him if he had told her beforehand. He explained that he was fighting to protect the Syrian people from their government. The police told her later that what he had written bore all the hallmarks of coached communication, the kind that terrorist organizations encouraged new recruits to send home. It was designed to reassure family members. And in some cases, it was also designed to serve as a recruitment tool, a window into the life of someone who had made the leap. Zach's email did some of that too. He said he was happy. He said he had been welcomed like a hero. He said his ISIS commander had given him and a group of other British recruits a week in a luxury hotel to adjust to the climate before their training began. After that week, he wrote, there would be a period where he would not be able to send emails. The connections had to be secure. He seemed to genuinely believe, my auntie said, that once she understood his reasons, she would be proud. She was not proud. She was terrified. She wrote back immediately. She begged him to come home. For weeks, there was silence. And then a reply came. And when she read it, my auntie told me, she did not recognize the person who had written it. The words were Zach's words in terms of the spelling and the syntax, but the person they came from was not the boy she had raised. The email spoke of jihad and martyrdom. It spoke of unbelievers using a word, kufr, that had never once come out of his mouth before. It twisted religious texts to justify what he had done, cherry-picking verses that could be bent toward violence while ignoring the overwhelming weight of Islamic teaching that calls for peace, for mercy, for the sanctity of human life. There is a verse, from Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 32, that states, whoever kills a soul, it is as though they have killed all of humanity. And whoever saves a life, it is as though they have saved all of humanity. My auntie quoted it to him in one of her emails. He dismissed it, saying it was being misused to make Muslims seem weak. It was as if every word of gentleness and wisdom in the faith had been stripped away, and what remained was a brittle, weaponized fragment of religion twisted beyond all recognition. He also told her not to worry too much about the people he encountered. The women and children his unit captured, he said, would not all be killed. Some would be kept as personal slaves. Others would be sold. My auntie wept reading that. The police officer wept with her. She wrote again. Long, careful, heartfelt emails. She spoke about his childhood. She reminded him of who he was, of the people who loved him, of the fact that coming home and facing the consequences was still possible, still survivable. She said there would be trouble, yes, but there would also be a family waiting for him. She waited weeks for each reply. And when the final one came, she read it with the hope that something she had written had reached him. Nothing had reached him. The email described what his unit had done during an attack on a Kurdish village. The defenders fought hard. They were overpowered. The civilians were gathered. The men and boys were taken to a field. And one by one, they were killed. Zach wrote that he had participated. He described it with what my auntie could only call glee, as though he had accomplished something magnificent. He had convinced himself that what he was doing was righteous and holy and that it was his path to the highest tier of paradise. That was the last email she ever received from him. The UK Home Office, my auntie told me, believes that Zach is almost certainly dead. Either killed in action or by an airstrike. ISIS's so-called caliphate eventually collapsed. He never came home. There were no more emails, no texts, no phone calls. Just silence. A silence that my auntie lives inside every single day. When she finished telling me everything, she asked if I understood now. Understood why she had asked us not to speak of him. Why there were no photographs. Why his name had been quietly removed from the family's shared conversation as if it had never existed. I understood. I understood the shame, and the grief, and the rage, and the heartbreak all twisted together into something that had no name. Zach was gone. And even setting aside whether he was physically alive or dead, the boy she had raised, the one who liked football and music and who had sat at her kitchen table and laughed at something ordinary, that boy had been gone for years before any of this. What was left was something she could not make sense of and could not stop thinking about. She did not need photographs to remember him. Her mind did that work for her, every minute of every day, whether she wanted it to or not. This is one of the hardest stories I have ever sat with. And if it has moved you in any way, please let me know in the comments. We do not need to explain our feelings. Just knowing that someone else heard this and felt something, that matters. Story 4, What My Uncles Handled. This last story begins, of all places, with a dream. Not the sleeping kind. The waking kind. The kind that you carry with you for years and years and slowly, carefully, begin to make real. For a long time, I had wanted to open a daycare center. I will not say which state I live in, but I will tell you that the licensing process there is thorough, demanding, and slow in the way that anything involving children's safety should be. There are background checks. There are inspections. There are forms and applications and waiting periods that stretch out over months. And part of the overall process involves verifying that any potential site is not in close proximity to registered child predators. There is a public registry for this purpose, a website that shows you the names and general locations of people in your area who have committed offenses against children. I do not recommend spending any more time on that website than you absolutely have to. The sheer number of entries is deeply unsettling. But for the purposes of my daycare search, I used it to cross-reference potential locations. I would pull up a site I was considering and check the map. And one afternoon, while going through this process, I clicked on an entry near one of the locations I was evaluating and saw a name. The last name was the same as mine. I want to be clear, it is not a common name. It is genuinely unusual. Not a Smith or a Johnson or anything that might appear twice in a given area by pure coincidence. And I did not recognize the first name. Which was a relief, at first. But given how uncommon our family name is, I could not fully dismiss the possibility that this person might somehow be connected to us. So I called my uncle and asked him, as casually as I could manage, whether we had any relatives I might not know about. The moment I finished the question, my uncle said, "Who told you?" No one had told me. I explained the circumstances, the daycare application, the registry search, the name that appeared in nearly the same location I was hoping to open my business. My uncle told me he would come over to explain in person. He did. And what he told me was this: the man on the registry was a relative. After his conviction, the family had made a collective decision to cut all ties with him completely. That conviction was nearly 3 decades old by the time I was looking at his name on a screen. He had already served his time and been released from prison. But the family had also, my uncle explained, made very clear to this man that he was to leave the state. They had not wanted his name associated with theirs any further than it already had been. They had made sure he moved. Or so they had believed. He had come back. Quietly, secretly, he had settled in a county not far from where we lived and had been living there without anyone in the family knowing. Until I had stumbled across him by accident while trying to open a daycare center. My uncle asked me what I planned to do about the location. I told him the obvious, I would have to find somewhere else. With a daycare center, having one convicted child predator in the surrounding area is one too many. Full stop. And that was when my uncle said, very calmly and very firmly, that I should not change my location. He would take care of it. He and some of the other uncles. They would handle it. Within a week, he said, there would be no child predators in that area when I went to file my application. I was naive enough, in that moment, to take those words at face value. I grew up surrounded by uncles who were protective and loud and full of strong opinions, but who were, as far as I knew, basically decent men. When he said they would handle it, I pictured something along the lines of a very uncomfortable conversation. A threat. A warning. I made very clear to him that he needed to go. And then, about a week later, I happened to catch a brief news story on the television. A man had gone missing. Several counties over. In very nearly the exact area where I had been planning to open my daycare. And when they said his name, I recognized it immediately. He had not moved. He had disappeared. I called my uncle. I asked what they had done. What had actually happened. He told me they had frightened him so badly that the man had fled the state. That he would surface eventually, somewhere far away, somewhere that was not here. He would be someone else's problem. But he would not be ours. I have never been able to fully decide whether I believe that. Part of me wants to. Part of me knows that this man had not just a conviction, but a long pattern of serious offenses against children, and that the uncles I grew up with were not the kind of men who would leave something like that to chance. And then there is another part of me, a quieter part, the one I try not to listen to too often, that thinks about what they might have done and finds that it cannot honestly say he did not deserve it. I opened my daycare. I have been running it for years now. It is the fulfillment of something I worked toward for a very long time, and I love it with everything I have. The children who come through my doors every day deserve every safe, warm, joyful thing I can give them. I have never told anyone about the rest of it. Not a single person. Until now. These are the kinds of stories that remind us how much is hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. The secrets tucked into old leather bags. The photographs kept between pages. The family members no one mentions by name anymore. The things people do to protect the ones they love, or the things they do to live with the ones they could not protect at all. Thank you so much for being here with us today. If these stories have stayed with you, if they have made you feel something, please leave a comment below. And if you have your own story, something you have carried quietly, something that has never had a place to land, share it with us. This community listens. That is what we are here for. If you are new here, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new narration. And if you know someone who needs to hear stories like these, stories that remind them that life is complicated and full of things we never see coming, and that they are not alone in that, share this video with them today. What do you think stays with you the most from what you heard today? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.